Our next speaker is David Goldman. He last spoke for the college on campus in the spring of 2017 during his residency on campus as a Pulliam Journalism Fellow. And I should mention that David speaks for the college both on land and at sea. He was a speaker on our Alaska cruise in 2016. When he's not busy speaking for Hillsdale, he is a columnist for the Asia Times, where he writes the Spengler column. He also writes regularly on politics for numerous other outlets, including PJ Media and the Claremont Review of Books. He doesn't only write on politics, he's also the classical music critic for Tablet magazine. He's directed research departments at various investment banks, and he's been a consultant for the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. He's a senior fellow of the London Institute for Policy Studies and a member of the Board of Advisors of American Affairs, whose editor we heard from this morning. He's also the author of a book, How Civilizations Die and Why Islam is Dying Too. He will be speaking today on the subject of China and Russia. Would you please welcome to the podium David Goldman.
Thanks, David. Tim, thank you for that very kind introduction. I can't tell you how gratified I am to be among you today and how grateful I am to Hillsdale College for inviting me. This is a unique group of people. You're precious and important, and it's a privilege to spend time with you. My only trepidation is I have to follow one of the greatest acts in history, Larry Arnn. That's intimidating, but I'll do my best. The one theme I'd like to keep in mind as we talk about the formidable strategic challenge that China especially, and in a different way Russia, pose to us, is that Russia and China are motivated by insecurity and fear. America has inherent strengths, which they do not, and our greatest danger is not our lack of capacity or lack of strength, but our complacency. China is a phenomenon unlike anything in economic history. If I can leave you with one number to think about, it's that the average Chinese now consumes 17 times as much as he or she did back in 1987. It's the difference between driving a car and riding a bicycle. It's the difference between indoor plumbing and a dirt floor in an outhouse. It's an absolutely remarkable and sudden change, which has lifted what was a backward country into the first rank of world economies, and really has no comparison. Just one other thing to keep in mind. China has, in the last 35 years, moved approximately 600 million people from the countryside to the cities. That's the equivalent of all of Europe from the Ural Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. And to do that, they've built the equivalent of a new London, Berlin, Rome, Glasgow, Helsinki, Naples, Lyon, to accommodate them. And of course, as you move people whose ancestors spent millennia in the tedious monotony of traditional life and bring them into the industrial world, their productivity explodes. Nothing like that's ever happened in history. Now, where do we stand with respect to China? The economists use something called purchasing power parity. In other words, if you take a bunch of dollars into China, you can buy a whole lot more for it than you can in the United States. So adjusted for that, the Chinese economy is already bigger than ours. If you keep it in dollar terms, we're still bigger, but they are certainly gaining on us, and sometime in the next 8 to 10 years, they'll be at parity. So unlike any competitor we've had in the past, we have an economy which is roughly on par with ours. Now, most important thing to remember about Russia and China is they are empires based on coercion of unwilling people, where the United States created a great nation out of willing immigrants who came here because they want to be part of the United States as individuals, China and Russia conquered peoples, different ethnicities, and different languages and kept them in by force. So whereas we have a pluribus unum, they still have a pluribus pluribus, except for a dictatorship sitting on top. Now, China started out, as you can see, as a relatively small area. It's kind of like the Continental Republic, which occupied a tiny part of the continent. It took them about 1,500 years to reach their borders, but by around the 9th century, China had reached the natural frontiers and didn't expand after that. They can't expand over the Himalayas to India. To their extreme west is desert. And to their east, of course, is the ocean. So China is not an inherently expansionist power. But it's never been a unified country. Chinese culture is unique, very different from ours. China has two languages. It has a written system of characters, which requires approximately the first 7 years of elementary education, working 4 hours a day with an ink brush and ink pot and paper to master. To be literate in Chinese, to read the several thousand characters needed to read a school textbook or a newspaper, is approximately a 6 or 7 year exercise for Chinese kids. That's how the Chinese are socialized. China had a literacy rate of about 30% at 2,000 years ago, many times higher than Europe, only exceeded by the Jewish literacy rate at the time. This generation is the first where the majority of Chinese understand a common language because of the centralization of the state, mass media, and so forth. But they still speak very different languages. Cantonese and Mandarin are as different as Finnish and French. In Hong Kong, you'll see Chinese screaming at each other in broken English because one speaks Mandarin, the other speaks Cantonese, and they don't have a word in common. So that state is always inherently unstable because it's held together by a common imperial culture and by the tax collector in Beijing. China is like a bag of very powerful, oppositely charged magnets held together by superglue. It looks very stable, but it inherently isn't. And in fact, in the memory of living Chinese, you had an era of national division, warlordism, civil war, starvation, degradation, the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars in 1848 and ended with the Communist Revolution in 1947, was one in which civil wars claimed, in the 19th century, one claimed between 50 and 100 million lives. World War II, 25 million Chinese died. So the terror of return to conditions that are not far from the living memory of many Chinese is still a specter that haunts the Chinese leadership. Russia, similarly, from Kievan Rus, conquered its east, conquered the Caucasus and parts of Persia, with the result that Russia has a Muslim population that amounts to 1/7 of its citizens. They're restive, they're problematic. China also has a much smaller Muslim population in its west. That's the Uyghurs. There are about 12 to 14 million of them. They're a Turkic people. They're Muslim. They don't really speak Chinese, but the Xinjiang province, the westernmost province of China, is inhabited by a majority of them, and it's a continuous source of fear to the Chinese state. So you have inherently unstable countries. In the case of Russia, Russia has always been a set of failed projects of eastern expansion supported by collection of taxes on the industrial part in the West. There's always been a tendency for the West to try to secede and move towards Europe. That was one of the causes of World War I, and for the East to break off. So a country like Russia has never lent itself to kind, gentle, and rational rulers. By comparison to his predecessors, Vladimir Putin is certainly one of the least bloodthirsty, least murderous rulers that Russia has had in its long and difficult history. It's very well to talk about democracy in Russia. I wish them well, but the imperial system has lent itself towards a centralized dictatorship in which a single man sitting in the Kremlin has to contend with centrifugal forces which require often a bloody response. Most important thing to know about China is the Chinese don't like China. Chinese have a dual existence. If you walk down the street in Beijing, you see people who dress very drably, who show no emotion in public, who do their best not to draw attention to themselves. But if you go to a Chinese wedding or a Chinese home or even a restaurant on Sunday where families gather, they're loud, they're bumptious, they laugh, the kids run riot. Their real existence is a family existence. That's why, by the way, the Lunar New Year is so important, which is occurring right now. During the Lunar New Year, the Chinese every year have the largest migration in human history. 4 billion long-distance journeys are undertaken because every Chinese, wherever they are, will travel thousands of miles to be with their family. In the West, in the Roman tradition, we have a concept of rights and privileges. You serve in the army, you pay your taxes, and the Roman state has certain obligations to you. You have privileges, and you have rights in return for the obligations that you fulfill to the state. That's never been a concept in China. The tax collector in Beijing rules by whim. You do everything that the emperor asks you to do, and you hope that he rewards you. But there's no sense of anything deserved. The idea that the state is held together by a common interest, as Cicero said, or by a common love, as St. Augustine said, is unknown in China. The emperor is a necessary evil. Chinese have had an emperor for 3,000 years, and when they didn't have an emperor, they killed each other. It's all very well to lecture the Chinese about the benefits of Western democracy. But most Chinese will say we need an emperor because we'd kill each other, and when we didn't have an emperor or didn't have a strong emperor during the century of humiliation, that's exactly what happened. So we prefer to have a strong emperor. And from the standpoint of most Chinese, this imperial dynasty, this Communist Party dynasty, has brought about a golden age. It's the first time in Chinese history where no one's afraid of starving to death. No one's afraid of a warlord coming through and raping the women and burning the crops. There's security and prosperity. Relative to Chinese history, it's a very good period. So for the time being, the regime has a great deal of support, and as deplorable as I find the practices of the Chinese regime, which as a totalitarian entity is more comprehensive and more intrusive than Hitler or Stalin could ever imagine being. As deplorable as I find it, I think the prospects for transforming it by our good offices are, for the time being, negligible. So what has the dynasty tried to do to stay in power? Well, the first thing they said is, well, China's basic historical problem is we've got a lot of people but not much arable land. Big country, mostly mountains and deserts. So every time you had prosperity, you had an increase in population, there were too many peasants, you'd have a peasant rebellion, and the dynasty would fall. So we have a one-child policy, and we evacuate the countryside. No peasants, no rebellion. Biggest social engineering exercise in human history, deeply motivated by the dynasty's desire to perpetuate itself in power. Instead of a family-based imperial dynasty, you have a party-based meritocracy. When I say meritocracy, we say no child left behind. The Chinese say only the exceptional survive. One of the problems the Chinese have in understanding American politics is if you're in the Chinese leadership, you come from a track of high exam scores, starting with 12, which means you haven't met a stupid person since you were in junior high school. And the idea that democracies can frequently advance stupid people, we're entitled to do that if we wish to, doesn't make any sense to them. So they're very clever people. The one thing Xi Jinping, president of China, cannot do is get his child into Peking University, the equivalent of Harvard or Stanford, unless that child scored sufficiently high on the exam. Harvard's easy. You can buy your way in, buy a building. You can't do that in China. The meritocracy in that respect is absolute. So the Chinese Communist Party is not a particularly efficient or good organization, but it has a lot of very smart people in it. And along with ensuring internal stability at all costs, they wish to make China impregnable from the outside. I'll get to this in a second. I don't know how long it's been since you've heard the term South China Sea, but it's kind of dropped out of the newspapers in the last year. It's become a Chinese lake. The Chinese have made clear they'll go to war over the South China Sea. Why will they do that? There's a Chinese proverb, kill the chicken for the instruction of the monkey. The Chinese concern is not the South China Sea so much as Taiwan. China's terrified that one rebel province, for example, Taiwan, could set a precedent for centrifugal forces that the party couldn't control. So the adhesion of Taiwan to the Chinese state, the Chinese emperor, is for the Chinese Communist Party an existential matter for the future existence of the state. They will go to war over it. And by demonstrating their willingness to fight over the South China Sea, they're saying, in effect, a fortiori will we fight all the more viciously over Taiwan or Tibet. I'm going to skip over this. This is in terms of the Chinese economy, this is the key slide. It's a bit complicated, so give me just a moment. It's worth your while to stare at it for a second. China does something that the Japanese do, the Koreans do, all the Asians do, which is to massively subsidize capital investment in heavy industry. From the Asian standpoint, a steel mill, a semiconductor fabrication plant, a big industrial investment is a public good, the same way that we'd look at a highway, an airport, or something else that we'd pay for out of public funds. So the result of Chinese subsidies for heavy industry is that they've pushed us out of any major capital-intensive manufacturing. That's the decisive thing. The Japanese were doing it, and that's why we forced the Japanese to build car plants in the United States under the Reagan administration. But Japan is still very small compared to the United States. The difference is that the Chinese are doing this in an economy which is roughly our size, so it has a massive impact. So what I show here is the capital intensity of all the companies in the major Chinese stock index, in the MSCI China Stock Index, versus their return on equity. The more capital intensive, the higher the return on equity. In the United States, if you look at the S&P 500, the slope is in the other direction. More capital-intensive industries are less profitable. And the distortion of global investment by Asian and particularly Chinese subsidies for heavy industry has led to a stripping of capital out of heavy industry. It's not that people prefer financial assets to real assets, it's that the Chinese have pushed us out of it. And that's why we've lost so much ground in terms of industry. I think Julius Krein showed a similar slide to this. I published this one in the Wall Street Journal in an article I wrote jointly with Henry Crisell just as Trump was elected. So China's share of high-tech exports has risen from about 5% in 1999 to about 25% at present, while America's has gone from about 20% to about 7%. That's not a desirable situation. What it means practically is that we can't build a military aircraft without Chinese chips. That's a national security issue. So, looking forward, China wants to move into dominance in high-tech industry. And when you look at this One Belt, One Road plan to dominate industry through Eurasia, it is like the Japanese Greater Asian Prosperity Sphere, but it has a different spin. For my sins, I spent some years as a development economist, and the main thing you notice in so-called developing economies is they don't develop because 40% of the people are outside the formal economy. They're in the so-called underground economy. They have little market stalls or hustles or whatever, and they live unproductive lives. They sit waiting for someone to come along and buy a liter of cooking oil. Huge amounts of wasted effort. What the Chinese have done is to rip out the social structure of village life and globalize it. China is nothing like the Japanese economy. There's no comparison. There's some comparisons, but remember, Japan, above all, wanted to maintain its social structure. It protected agriculture, it protected small retail, protected small business. So in the Japanese economy, you have a few great companies with global capacity sitting on top of a very backward, protected, inefficient economy. China sucked people out of the villages, put them in the cities. Their equivalent of Amazon, Alibaba, will take over the entire labor of Chinese villages. There are broadband stretching all over the country, so some entrepreneur in a village will figure out something the village can make, then the whole village works for him. They've intentionally ripped out the social structure, and that's why they don't have the same constraints as Japan. And what they propose to do is repeat that experiment throughout all of Asia, to Sinify everywhere, from Turkey through to Southeast Asia. A couple of years ago, I'll tell you a story. I visited Huawei headquarters. Huawei is the great telecommunications company, biggest in the world, hardly existed a dozen years ago. Now it's got 70% of the world market in telecommunications. How they do it? They cut prices and they got subsidies from the government. They did it dirty. And they have a campus that looks like a science fiction movie. Makes Stanford look like a slum. And to get the tour, I arranged to have a Latin American ambassador and his team come with me. So I did that because I wanted to see it. But after the tour of their exhibition hall, which took 3 hours, and incredible technologies on display, the Chinese sat these Latin Americans down in a little amphitheater, and they said, if you turn your economy over to us, we will make you like China. We'll put in telecommunications. We'll put in broadband. We'll bring in e-commerce. We'll bring in e-finance. And you will be like China, too. Now, the Latin Americans didn't take them up on them, but the Turks did. Turkey plans to be a cashless society in 5 years. The Chinese telecommunications companies are rebuilding the Turkish broadband network. The reason Turkey feels comfortable cocking a snook at the United States is because they've given up on the West. They're the Western economic province of China. And the impact of this global plan is felt all over the world in former allies or former NATO members orienting towards China and giving us all kinds of trouble. Russia has quadrupled its energy exports to China, totally dependent on China economically. China likes the idea of having land-based energy imports, just in case the United States gets it into our head to interfere with seaborne energy traffic. So Russia, with what, a 12th the population of China, tiny economy relatively, is really, although the Chinese and Russians certainly don't like each other, is very dependent on China. China has a high-speed rail network where you have trains going at 200 miles an hour, so that you could easily live in Tampa and work in Miami. It's had huge productivity effects, and they're proposing to build them all over Southeast Asia. Thailand used to be an American ally, is being absorbed into the Chinese economy. Thailand is an agricultural country. They figured out that with high-speed trains, they could become the truck garden for China. They do all of the fresh fruits and vegetables. So China's being Thailand's being absorbed, and so forth. Now, the most dangerous idea or dangerous misconception about China is that they can't innovate. I've heard people say they can only copy, but they can't invent things. Well, who do you think invented gunpowder, the magnetic compass, the clock, and movable type? The culture certainly can invent. Now, of course, it's a much more conformist culture. On average, Chinese are less likely to be innovators, but there's still lots of them. And their R&D spending is going to catch up with ours. They're already producing 4 times as many STEM bachelor's degrees and twice as many STEM PhDs. Granted, some of them are low quality, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of the Chinese PhDs are terrific. I worked for several years for a Chinese-owned investment bank out of Hong Kong. We took some of these guys public, and they were real go-getting innovators. They're as good as anything in Silicon Valley. So the single biggest deficiency we have in the United States, in my view, is not the industrial base. That's easier to deal with than the lack of scientific and engineering education. I think 6 or 7% of our kids major in engineering. China's 30, 40%. That's the real problem we've got. So Julius already mentioned some of these things. So the problem we have, in my view, is not so much that we have tariffs, we have trade agreements, whatever. We have a massive distortion of the global system by Chinese industrial policy. It's such a large economy, it has that gravitational effect. Not only that, the Chinese also play very dirty. One of the things the Trump administration brought up and mentioned in its national security strategy is forced technology transfer. Intel wants to get access to the Chinese market, biggest chip market in the world. The Chinese say, that's fine. You teach us how to do everything you know how to do, and we'll give you access. Now, from the standpoint of Intel's stock price in the next 5 to 10 years, that's a pretty good deal. I mean, it may not be good for the United States, but it's good for Intel's stock price. If we were to say, excuse me, we're not going to let you transfer your technology to China with a gun to your head, the first people to scream about it would be the Intels and the Texas Instruments of the world, because it wouldn't be good for their stock price, and the CEO is supposed to be worried about the stock price. I'm a free trader, I'm a free marketer, but national security sometimes supervenes. This would be such a case. If you look at where investment goes in R&D, I'm not going to burden you with more of the data, but you can see that we had a lot of investment in computers, peripherals, telecommunication equipment. That's basically zeroed out in the last few years, and virtually all of the investment has gone into software. So we've conceded to Asia, not just China, Taiwan and Korea as well, and Japan, the actual manufacturing, such that, as I said, we can't put a warplane in the air without Asian chips. And since the security of chips, the encryption is built into the chip itself, that is a serious national security concern. So what do we do about it? I don't care whether industrial policy is a good idea, a bad idea, or neither of the above. We Americans can't do it. As Americans, we have a radical conception of individual liberty. We are not good at being collectivists. Germany has industrial policy. Culturally, they can deal with it. We cannot. If we're going to win this one, we've got to win it the American way. And that radical commitment to liberty, I mean, no other country in the world told people they've got a right to pursue happiness, to make of themselves whatever they wanted. What we are best at is innovation. My life experience is that in the 1970s, all the smart people thought that Russia was going to win the Cold War. All the economists thought Russia had a great economy, including the CIA economists, including Paul Samuelson, the author of the Standard Textbook. That's what everybody said. And then by 1989, we realized the whole Russian economy was one gigantic piece of junk. It might as well have been an 8-track tape player. It was worthless. It was actually a negative worth because the environmental cleanup was worth more than the scrap value of whatever they were producing. What happened in the interim? What happened was the greatest wave of industrial innovation in American history. We invented fast, light, and small and cheap microchips. We invented sensors that didn't exist before. We invented the semiconductor laser, and we did virtually all of this through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and NASA in cooperation with the great corporate laboratories. Henry Crisell, whom Julius Krein mentioned before, had the honor to co-author a number of articles with him. He was then head of RCA Labs. They invented CMOS chip manufacturing. Why were American avionics so fabulous? Totally crushed the Russian Air Force. Russians knew they couldn't win a war against us by 1983 and 1984, when in 1978 they were pretty confident. In 1978 was when we put the chips into an F-15 that made look-down radar possible. And then the Israelis used them in 1982 in the Bekaa Valley turkey shoot when they wiped out the Syrian Air Force. Don't know how many of you remember that, but it was American avionics versus Russian avionics, and it was 8-0, basically. And the Russians looked at it and they said, "We have a problem." We turned the Russian economy into junk by creating an economy that hadn't existed before. That was the Reagan economy. The Fortune 500 lost employment during the 1980s. Corruption comes from monopolies. The monopolies were all ruined. New companies no one ever heard of sprang up to commercialize these technologies. And we had the least corrupt economy because we had challengers doing new things, taking market share away from the existing entrenched interests. 1983, I wrote a memo for the National Security Council arguing that the Strategic Defense Initiative would pay for itself, that the impact of the new technologies that we were researching, once they were commercialized, would generate more tax revenue than we'd spent on the R&D. When you do basic R&D, you don't know the outcome. The reason CMOS chip manufacturing came about was because somebody at the Pentagon thought it would be great for fighter pilots to have their own weather forecasting module in the cockpit. No one realized what they could do with look-down radar. We got the semiconductor laser because someone at the Pentagon wanted to light up a battlefield at night for night warfare. And that produced consequences that rippled through the economy that nobody could imagine. That's what we haven't been doing. Our hearts grew fat. Starting with the Clinton administration, we felt we were so powerful we didn't have to do these things anymore. So the investment went into the internet bubble of the 1990s, where the whole world would be based on downloading movies and watching pornography. That was going to be the economy of the future. I'm a market guy. The one thing markets, though, cannot do is divorce themselves from culture. Long-term expectations are cultural. And when we have a national security requirement, where we have to go to the frontier of physics to develop weapons that will protect us and be better than the other fellows, that's when you get the best kind of innovation. So my view is, yes, we need to, the state has a role, a critical role, in meeting this Russian and Chinese challenge. But we can only do this as Americans by doing what we're good at. If we try to do something we're not good at, like industrial policy, we will fail at it, even if on paper it looks like a good idea, which, by the way, I don't think so. But we can innovate and commercialize better than anyone else. And if the Chinese are spending tens of billions of dollars to build the chip fabrication plants, and we come up with a better way of doing it, suddenly they'll have $100 billion worth of worthless chip manufacturing plants on their hands. And you can't predict the outcome in advance. You have to make the commitment and to have a leap of faith that American ingenuity and science will be the answer. We can win this, but we have to win it as Americans in the American way. Thank you very much.
Please raise your hand and the mic will be brought to you.
You say that Islam is failing. Could you expand upon that for a moment, please?
Well, Islam is a culture that goes directly from infancy to senility without passing through adulthood. And I mean that in the literal sense. Every Muslim country that has achieved the equivalent of full adult literacy has experienced a rapid and sudden demographic collapse. Iran is the great example of it. This is a bit off my topic, but since you ask, when Iran had its disastrous Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iranian women on average had 7 children. Now it's about 1.8. It's the fastest decline in population growth in all of recorded history. And what it means is that as this generation retires, there'll be nobody to support them. You've got Iranian pension systems where there are more people receiving pensions than paying in. You know how long that's going to last. So Iran, in 20, 25 years, is going to have an elderly dependent ratio higher than Germany's, with 1/10 the per capita income, which means they'll implode. Turkey. Ethnic Turks are having fewer than 2 children. The Kurds are having 3 children. They're having twice as many children as the Turks. We did a study of this at the Defense Department and concluded that no matter what assumptions you put into the model, by about 25 years from now, the majority of all Turkish citizens under the age of 30 would come from Kurdish households. The Kurds would no longer be a minority. That's why the Turkish government is bombarding our ex-friends, the Kurds, in northern Syria, because they're terrified of a breakaway Kurdish state. Of course, if they came to their senses, they'd realize the best thing they could do would be allow the Kurds, if they wanted to carve out a state in the impoverished mountainous southeast and not fight them, but they're not sensible. So you have countries like Pakistan with illiteracy of 50%, which still have 4 children per female. They can't feed themselves, they can't produce enough electricity, they have chronic power shortages, they have environmental disasters, they're subject to perpetual chaos, and you have countries like Iran and Turkey, which are suffering from demographic implosion. It's the poles of infancy or senility. So I don't see any of the major Muslim countries achieving a successful transition into modern economic life, and they'll be in a perpetually chaotic state. That's what I mean by Islam is dying. In the case of Iran, once you get literacy, you don't get a lot of Islam. Iran is one of the least Islamic countries in the world, one of the least religious, kind of like Russia in the 1980s, where there weren't any communists except in the Central Committee. Iran's rate of mosque attendance is estimated at 4 or 5%. Unfortunately, the religious loonies are the ones with all the money and all the guns. But it's a very unstable mess, and I think if we put our mind to it, we could crack that regime like an eggshell.
You're right on regarding the research background that we need to have in this country to go forward. I spent a career in research at General Motors, and I remember working very closely with Bell Labs at GE and Westinghouse, who are now virtually gone. And so I wonder what your perspective is in terms of corporate investment today in R&D that should keep our nation strong and innovative in the future.
Corporate R&D includes a lot of things, like making a better class of cornflake, which doesn't have a lot, maybe good for people like cornflakes, but doesn't, nothing, I'm not disparaging, but it doesn't have anything to do with national security. No, the tragedy is we had great research organizations like Bell Labs, RCA Labs, GE Labs, and so forth, which really don't exist anymore. And it was understood that some of your best engineers would serve out their time, do something innovative, then they get financing and start their own company. So you'd have a conveyor belt, really, coming from DARPA with the most advanced physics research going into commercialization. So the one thing I can say is that corporate America is going to have to reorient towards that. There are things that we could do to give them a little bit of a shock. For example, I mean, I'm a free trader, I'm a free market guy, but as President Orange said this morning, the one thing that supervenes is national security. That's when we postpone our pursuit of happiness and stand shoulder to shoulder and defend ourselves. One thing that Dr. Crisell and I advocated in the Wall Street Journal piece I mentioned was domestic content for defense goods. It's outrageous that we're flying warplanes with Chinese chips. Any sensitive good should be manufactured in the United States. Now, we could do that by executive order, and the first thing that would happen, Intel and Texas Instruments and Raytheon would all come to the Pentagon and say, listen, for years you told us cut costs, so we moved our supply chain offshore. We did what you told us to. Now you're telling us bring it back onshore? We'll say, that's what I'm saying, slick. And they'll say, you know how much money that's going to cost us? We fear quite a lot. That's going to cut into our profits. Well, we'll give you cost plus 10%. They're not going to like it. First people who scream about it will be the corporate sector. But if you use the power of the American state to require certain kinds of activity as a matter of our existential security interests, you'll change corporate behavior real fast. May not be good for some people's stock price. You get a lot of screaming. It can only be done by a strong president and a strong Secretary of Defense. Nothing else is going to do it. Can't set up a commission, got to come from the top.
Do you see China making an aggressive move on its colony, Hong Kong, to further suppress its democratic instincts?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, my office in Hong Kong overlooked the student demonstrations across the street from the government offices in Admiralty in Hong Kong. This was a middle-class rebellion by students who were very dissatisfied with their economic prospects. They were very careful not to get themselves into trouble because they all wanted careers. They were not going to die for democracy. It was very limited in its scope. And in Beijing or Shanghai, the attitude towards the Hong Kong kids was they're sort of spoiled upper-class kids and they've got all these privileges. Why aren't they happy with what they've got? The Chinese don't need to suppress it, and that movement is not a real threat. Hong Kong is very important to the Chinese for a simple reason. China never had a system of laws. The emperor was a system of law is, I tell you to jump and you ask me how long to stay in the air. China has British law. So a lot of companies, including major Chinese multinationals, do their business out of Hong Kong because their counterparties require Western law. No threat to them, and it's very useful. So I think status quo is what's going to happen in Hong Kong.
You want to hold that? Very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
I'm from Michigan, and we currently have a Sharia compliant running for governor in a Democratic ticket. We are involved in a very activist program to educate people about Sharia compliance. And when you say that the countries are not reproducing, our feedback here is because we're getting so many immigrants coming from those countries. They're rapidly increasing their populations here, bragging that they're going to have 4 and 8 kids. They've all got 4 wives. And the people here really know nothing about it. That your optimism about Islam is interesting, but I don't think that's going to prevail here in the United States.
Well, I strongly support the president's merit-based immigration policy, and I think if that's implemented, that'll go a long way to solving our problems.
Returning to China, is that China's had a couple of policies, kind of a two-pronged aspect of it. One is the one-child policy, which they have liberalized a little bit more recently. And the second portion of it is that the retirement system was always the male. They went to the parents went to the male's family, therefore they didn't need females, and there was some of that genocide. Of those two prongs there, what is the long-term impact on China and their culture from those decisions?
That's a terrific question. No one knows the answer. I think at a 50 or 100-year horizon, China may be in very serious trouble demographically. They now have a two-child policy. We haven't seen any change in fertility behavior since that change, though it is soon. One thing the Chinese figured out under the one-child policy is that since it's a winner-take-all system, there are only a very few slots at the top, and everyone fights ferociously to get into those slots. It makes sense to concentrate your resources on your one princeling and prepare him or her for the university exams and aim for maximum success. So, for example, there are 100 million classical music students in China. This is paid for by private tuition, as parents have figured out, or they believe, I think correctly, that getting your kid playing piano or violin helps academic concentration, is good overall. Having 2 children makes it a little bit more difficult. So fertility behavior may have changed permanently, in which case China will be in demographic trouble at some point. Its workforce is going to start to decline probably in the next 10 years. There are probably a couple of 100,000 Chinese that are not counted by the census who were born mainly in the countryside, say in the 1980s, just weren't registered. So it's not quite as bad short-term as it looks, but long-term, your point is very well taken. Now, in the meantime, if China is able to mobilize its one belt, one road system, they can solve labor shortages by outsourcing. So, for example, they've just built a couple of fast railroads to Turkey. They could put components on a container, bring them to a plant in central Anatolia, have inexpensive Turkish labor assemble it there and sell it to Europe. There are several 100 million people in Southeast Asia who have Asian values. They work very hard. They believe in education. A lot of them are really not integrated into the industrial economy, but they could be. So from the standpoint of where the United States stands, the Chinese demographics is not going to be the kind of liability for China in a way that enters into strategic calculations at a 25-year horizon. Longer than that, it could be China's Achilles heel.
You didn't mention anything about the connection between China and North Korea, and they're not deterring North Korea in their EMP endeavor to take the United States out. Is China going to take any interest in that?
China wants to play arsonist and fireman at the same time. They've encouraged the North Koreans quietly. All of the North Korean missiles use Chinese components. or components delivered from overseas by Chinese companies. About a year ago, the South Korean Navy fished a North Korean booster rocket out of the ocean, put up a satellite. They recovered the booster, and they found it was full of Chinese components. So we know that the Chinese are doing this. No, the Russians are doing it too. And then the Chinese can say, well, aren't we being helpful by trying to help you deal with the North Koreans? It's a way of, getting leverage over the United States. The Chinese want to have a nuclear war with the United States? No. Why should they? Do they want the North Koreans to take us out? I don't believe so, because that's the kind of thing that might lead to a nuclear exchange. And they certainly hope to win without fighting. Are they playing dirty ball? Absolutely. My view of how we should respond to that is by instituting a crash program for space-based missile defense. We should have the capacity to shoot down anything the North Koreans put up within seconds of its being fired. Now, that's something the Chinese and Russians will not like at all. We've refrained from doing that on the grounds that it would be provocative. In other words, if we were able to stop the Chinese and Russians from shooting nuclear missiles at us, that would give us supposedly the capacity for a first strike. I don't care if they like it or not. They've got no business telling us how to defend ourselves. And that was what Reagan envisioned with SDI, except we didn't do it. Technology has improved a great deal. We certainly could do it. Our current missile defense is pathetic. So I would like to see us respond to that by scaring the pants out of them and putting up a fully capable space-based missile defense.
One thing you haven't commented on is the economics and how China goes on affording this. They've styled themselves for a long time as being a socialist economy, but a politician that we're all very familiar with at Hillsdale once remarked that the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Do you feel that this applies to China, and why or why not?
Well, the Chinese are not socialist. They are a dynasty trying to maintain its power, and they'll use whatever means they can. The Communist Party is the state party. It could be communist, fascist, or anything in between. The ideology really isn't the issue. Take the case of Jack Ma and Alibaba, certainly one of the great companies in the world. Matter of fact, Jack Ma bought the little investment bank I was working for and fired all of the Westerners, which is why I'm not working there anymore. Still have my stock in it, by the way. He's a great entrepreneur, but he is joined at the hip to Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. For one thing, they want to encourage the consumer. They want to keep the consumer happy, and Alibaba, like Amazon, is doing a great job of that. They're great at microfinance. But remember, the Chinese have massive data on everybody. Alibaba and all of these companies are hardwired also into the Chinese Ministry of State Security. They know everything about you. In China, they'll track your cell phone at all times, and they'll make sure you're carrying it by using facial recognition, and they'll in real time cross-grid that against social media postings and online purchases and financial transactions. They have capabilities for social control that Hitler and Stalin could have only begun to imagine. And the great entrepreneurs of China get to be super rich by becoming instruments of the Chinese state as well. Huawei is another terrific example. So they certainly want to harness the efforts of Chinese who wish to get rich and use their creativity, and they've opened things up to them. They've allowed a lot of people to get rich, while at the same time making sure that the interests of the state and the Communist Party are paramount. These guys know that they could be liquidated in a heartbeat if they get out of line. Now, it's a very different system, It's not socialism at all. It's China being China, where they will copy elements of Western capitalism and integrate them into a kind of social control which we as Americans find horrifying.
We have time for just one more question.
I'm sort of surprised I haven't heard more about India. I would think they pose some threats as well as some opportunities.
India, world's largest democracy, friend of ours, very high growth rate, but India has a number of obstacles to overcome that prevent it from being in the same league as China by a long margin. And one is that they've done nothing about their infrastructure. They still have the same railroads the British built over a century ago. China's totally transformed their infrastructure. My hometown of New York looks like a third world city compared to Shanghai or Beijing in terms of infrastructure. They have the world's largest high-speed train network. They have excellent highways. Airports look like science fiction sets. India infrastructure is catastrophic, and that's because their political system has been unable to centralize the resources to make that happen. They also have a caste system. They are not a meritocracy. If you're born into the lower castes, you basically stay there forever and all future generations. So India has hundreds of millions of people living in the most dire poverty, illiteracy, really primitive conditions of life. And there has been no effort. I mean, this Chinese migration of the cities, the 600 million people who moved from countryside to city, the vast amount of construction and infrastructure that's required to receive them. Indians have done nothing like this. They haven't even attempted it. It'd be great if they did, but India as a strategic factor is decades, if not centuries, behind China. Well, thank you all very much.